Hello and welcome to Football Geeks. On this week's show, we have a real treat. Our guest is curator and founder of the 80s and 90s football site on Twitter, and he's an avid nostalgist who specialises in Cold War football. The players, the clubs, the national teams, lost in time, but not in memory. It gives me great pleasure to welcome to the show this evening, Michael Hamlen. Good evening, Michael.
Yeah, evening, Phil. Lovely, really pleased to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
Oh, you're more than welcome. We've got a lot to cover tonight because we're going to really get kind of like digging deep and find out all about our subject tonight. So we'll be taking the DeLorean into football's rich past and exploring the massive turf in Eastern Europe, previously known as Yugoslavia, its history and its legacy. So, Michael, what is about football of that era that really excites you, mate?
It's a really interesting question. I think a lot of it stems from being a child, and I was really interested in geography. I think before football, and then I think football comes along and you marry the two up. And you know, I was 8, 9 when the Italian 90 comes along. You find all these teams, you sort of put the geography and the football together. And in this case, this team disappears a few years later, and I think the intrigue sort of kicks in. And wanting to learn about why that is and the history, and you know, eventually I end up going to university and studying politics and end up covering Bosnia as my dissertation. So yeah, it sort of stems geography, football, politics.
I think that's the way it always tends to go, isn't it? I always think also for places remote and unreachable, it makes it all that more alluring, and that makes you want to explore it more.
Yeah.
So tonight we're going to talk about Yugoslavia, and we're going to start. We're going to frame it in time. So we're going to start at around 1980, and we're going to move forward from there. I mean, obviously there were great teams before then. The '74 team that springs to mind. 1968 they reached the European Championship final. And in 1976 reached the European Championship semi-final. But we're going to move on from there, and we're going to start in 1980, and we're going to begin from a game that took place in 1980 on the 4th of May. A game that took place in the Poljud Stadion in Split between Hajduk and Red Star, and it was significant, wasn't it? There was a significance to that game, Michael.
Yeah, very much so, because obviously this is the game where, you know, it was announced that Tito had died, obviously the leader of Yugoslavia, and the match was interrupted. It was live on TV, and the players and the crowds, they all just almost fell to their knees and started crying. And I think a lot of that was the fact there was a lot of love for that leader, but I think the realization of the ideal of Yugoslavia could and probably would be coming to an end, which takes another few years to come to fruition, and obviously that happened. But I think it was almost tears of this. The future doesn't look bright anymore.
I think you probably, yeah. I think it would. I mean, from Tito as a politician, the way that he kind of took these 5 disparate fiefdoms and welded them into a sort of united country is one of the great political achievements of the last century, isn't it? Because none of those states particularly liked each other.
No, not at all. It takes a very special person to be able to do that. And you know, during the war, there was obviously lots of issues with all the different ethnicities, which obviously Tito managed to sort of unify under the partisans and the communists, and so managed to come out of World War II as a communist state and managed to play the East and the West off quite successfully, and as I said, managed to almost put all these old rivalries and hatreds back in a box and swept under the carpet. So yeah, it's a very good achievement to have achieved of all that.
Yeah, I think the year before he died, he was carousing with the Chinese government, wasn't he, to try and get them on side, to create a bit of distance between him and the Soviets. So it was a very kind of volatile and uncertain times in that corner of the world, which he kind of used to his advantage.
Oh, very much so, very much so. So as I said, when he'd gone, the country was left in a situation where there was no succession planning almost, and there was no guidance, or there was no plan really to go forward.
Yeah, and I mean that game in 1980 was significant also because something else we'll talk about a little bit later. 10 years on from that, there was another game with a very different outcome, but we'll leave that as a little kind of taster for things to come. So we're starting from 1980, and we're looking at the Yugoslavian football team of that era, the national team specifically. And in the early 80s tournaments, the senior team reached a couple of tournaments in which they played good technical football, but they didn't necessarily light up the competition. I'll be fair in saying that, wouldn't I? 82 and 84.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, you know, that they qualified for Spain 82. They qualified ahead of Italy, but they got knocked out in the group stage. They drew with Northern Ireland. They lost to Spain and beat Honduras, but they only beat them 1-0 on a really late penalty. So, as you said, they didn't set the world alight by any means. You know, and you're quite right. You know, technically, you know, the players, you know, they had all, to a degree, the right attributes, but they played such sort of defensive football, and they weren't the ones like didn't take the shackles off, and they sort of play within themselves. And that's, you know, they didn't go through to the next round, but that's pretty much the same as what happened at Euro 84. Again, they qualified ahead of Wales, and there's a really great 4-4 draw in Titograd. You know, I think Yugoslavia were winning 4-2, and then Wales meant to get 2 late goals. And again, they qualified. They're in a group with France, Denmark, and Belgium, and of course France being the host, and obviously that brilliant team of Platini and the Magic Square. Obviously Denmark, Danish Dynamite. You know, this is like the first tournament they appear at, and also they get better at Mexico 86. And obviously Belgium as well. Again, played within themselves, played very defensively. In the game, I think they take the shackles off, was against France, and they get beaten 3-2. Platini scores a fantastic hat-trick, left foot, diving header, and a fantastic free kick with his right foot. But it's, you know, they got beaten 2-0 in Belgium in the opening game, 5-0 against Denmark. You know, the only probably sort of ray of sunshine in this is the emergence, or is the introduction of Jagan Stojkovic at 84.
Yeah, and then there's that was a precursor for a very promising batch of footballers that came through a couple of years after that. You know, they missed out on the 1986 World Cup narrowly, I think, and then this whole new generation of young Yugoslavian players come through. Would you like to talk to us about the tournament that brought those two into people's kind of realization?
Yeah, the 87 FIFA World Youth Championships is sort of a bit of a mythical sort of tournament that's sort of talked about. You know, it's held in Chile. The Yugoslavs sort of sent their team almost out of obligation. They didn't think they were going to win. They left some players at home, actually. We'll come to those in a minute. But, you know, they went to Chile, as I said. They were based in Santiago, and they beat the host 4-2 in front of 100,000 people. And the Chilean fans really took to them. And then after that, they started supporting Yugoslavia. And there's quite a large sort of Yugoslav expat population over there, which they discovered, which they enjoyed the nightlife alongside those guys. I won't go into any more detail on that one. And they beat Australia 4-0, and they beat Togo 4-1 and got through the quarter-final. But in terms of the players that they took, you know, you're talking Boban, Prozanecki, Mijatovic, Suka, you know, Igor Stimac. And the players they didn't take Mihajlovic, Boksic or Jugovic, because they would deem they'd get more experience playing in the Yugoslav First Division than going to an international tournament. Which, you know, if you look at the players I just mentioned, the players that didn't go, those names are astounding. It's probably the best youth team championship team you'll ever see. So they played Brazil in the quarter-final and beat them 2-1. Mijatovic scored, and Prozanecki gets a fantastic last-minute free kick. It was interesting because the Red Star tried to take him back to Yugoslavia for a game, and the FIFA president Havelange got involved and said, "No, you're staying." And he sort of his gift almost with his last-minute free kick. And they played East Germany in the semis, beat them 2-1. You know, and that was a team that contained Matthias Sammer for East Germany. And then played West Germany in the final, and you know, they beat them they won on penalties, which again is a very rare thing, beating West Germany in a penalty shootout. And that team had Andres Müller. So there were some really good players playing for the other teams as well, but the team was not as well. It's not as stacked and star-studded as Yugoslavian team at all.
No, and it was a team that augured well for things to come, because the spine of that team kind of created the team that kind of came forth into the 1990 World Cup. So yeah. So I mean, what I'd like to talk, 1990 was a significant for Yugoslavian football. I mean, we'll go firstly into we talked about the 1980 game, but there was another game in 1990 where things went quite differently to the Hajduk Red Star one of 1980.
Well, yeah, and I think by this time it's pretty important to note that Yugoslavia was unraveling as a nation. You know what had happened after Tito's. Effectively, they brought in a 1974 constitution, which was supposed to make the country more stable going forward after Tito's death, and it actually did the opposite. And you sort of had a presidential sort of council, and each republic was supposed to have a vote. But what eventually happened was, you had 6 republics and 2 autonomous regions, and the 2 autonomous regions were within Serbia. And if a Serbian leader got in power that was able to manipulate the other leaders and take over those republics, that would give him 3 votes. And that person was Slobodan Milosevic. He came in power in 87, he manipulated, and then effectively, along with the Montenegrins, he'd then basically almost brought Yugoslavia to a sort of stalemate, in the sense of he had 4 votes on the council. So any decision to go forward with anything, he could almost veto and block. So of course the other sort of republics with Slovenia and Croatia and Bosnia, they weren't happy with this situation. So this is where you start getting this powder keg of nationalism comes into play, and it really spilled over in this game, because you know, just before this game on the 13th of May, there was Croatian elections, which they'd then sort of voted for a nationalist Croatian party. So then Red Star turn up. They bring, I think it's 3,000 fans that are led by Arkan, who obviously ends up being a war criminal in the Bosnian War. And it's basically organised violence. It's live on TV, so the whole of Yugoslavia could see this. And I think it was, you know, I think there was some quote saying that it was almost like what hell is upon us. You know, it was, you could see how the country was going through that one match. And you know, the Red Star fans turned up, and they said a lot of them got off at the wrong train station to sort of bypass the police and confuse the police, and they then started ripping up the stadium. They started sort of attacking fans, and the police almost just stood there and watched it. And it was only then when the Dinamo Zagreb fans sort of got involved and tried to retaliate that the police got involved. And then what this then created was the Red Star players left the pitch, but the Dinamo Zagreb players didn't. And this is when Boban enters the myth and the legend, almost not myth, actually the legend. But he obviously then goes over and kicks a policeman who actually wasn't Serbian, he was Muslim. But it didn't matter. It was very much, it's the identity and sort of almost like the birth of Croatia sort of almost comes from this match. And I know it's a bit far-fetched, and there's an argument to say yes and arguments to say no on that. But it made sort of Boban a national hero. And yeah, he was banned for 6 months and didn't go to Italia 90, unfortunately. But it was a massive, massive moment in the Yugoslav story.
Yeah, it really kind of cemented Croatian nationalism, didn't it? It took it out there to people who probably wouldn't have seen that kind of violence on the streets, because it wasn't really kicking off there then, was it? It was other places where that kind of separation had started to show itself. However, let's get back onto that's really interesting, really fascinating. It's the kind of stuff that I love to talk about. But let's get back to football for people who are expecting football tonight. But no, as we always say, I mean, politics and football does go hand in hand, regardless of how people say that they're separate entities. There is always politics at large within football and vice versa. However, sandwiched between the carnage of the kind of disintegration of Yugoslavia, there were 2 tournaments that firmly established Yugoslavia as a team to be reckoned with. Should we talk about the 2 tournaments of 1990, Michael?
Yes. So the under-21 tournament actually was a strange tournament in the sense of that they qualified for that, but the quarterfinal and the semi-final were held before Italia 90, and the final was held after Italia 90, which is a very strange format compared to what you get now. So I suppose if we talk about the quarter-final and the semi-final, maybe then touch on Italia 90, then come back onto the final and try and put it in chronological order. That Yugoslavia played Bulgaria in the quarter-final, and they won that one over 2 legs. That sort of Bulgaria team had Kostadinov and Balakov, which were players obviously emerged later at USA 94. They beat Italy over 2 legs in the semi-final. They drew 0-0 at home. They drew 2-2 with Italy away and went through and away goals. That Italian team was a stacked team as well. They had Costa Curta at the back, Peruzzi, Passaraghi, Simeone, Lentini, Fuse, some great names there, some great Italian names there. So, of course, a lot of that team was the team that had been to 87. But then sort of Italia 90 sandwich right in the middle. And, of course, there was the famous friendly before Italia 90 that was held in Zagreb against the Dutch. And the national anthem was booed, and that was in the Maximir Stadium about a month after the game in the same stadium. And I think that the Yugoslavian sort of senior team going into that tournament was the players were really united, to be fair, from what I read. But I think there was they felt as if they weren't loved, and obviously that game in Zagreb didn't ease that thought, I should say. And I think they went into that tournament maybe a little bit nervous, and obviously got beaten 4-1 by West Germany. And also that's the game where Matthäus just is on a different level in that game. He scores 2 great goals, and Klinsmann gets a flying header. And I think, Villa gets the goal, the keeper spills it. And, they played, I think, quite defensively, and they played, I think, 5 at the back, and it didn't work. And I think, Osim sort of took the shackles off a bit against Colombia. Because this squad, it had the old and the new. It had a few new players in it. I think he took Suka, who didn't play. He took Boksic, who didn't play. But he took Prozanecki. Savicevic came through earlier, so now he was in the team alongside the likes of Susic, obviously Jagan Stojkovic, Borovic. There was a really good mix of old and new, but Osim used to lend towards the older players and the ones that he was it sort of looks after him or never sort of let him down before, and was reluctant to put the young players in. So they beat Colombia 1-0. I only posted that the other day actually on the page, and they nearly scored a wonderful second, which unfortunately they didn't post. But the move was unbelievable. They beat UAE 4-1, and again that's the game where Pancha came into the team, scored 2 goals. And he was a really, really good player that didn't get enough caps for Yugoslavia in that sort of late 80 period. Prozanecki scored as well. And, of course, then it's the game that really came to prominence, that I grabbed the attention with Yugoslavia. And that's the game against Spain.
It was when all that kind of talent kind of merged, wasn't it, and came together. Do you want to talk us through the main features of that game?
Well, against Spain, it really comes down to Jagan Stojkovic, let's be honest. But I think that the game was the game that really, I think he was brilliant against the UAE. But again, you've got to take it into context. It's the UAE. But against Spain, he was just on a different level. He'd obviously he'd arranged to go to Marseille before this, and this is the game I think that really sort of cemented or justified his fee. But yeah, it was the first goal was one I just love this first goal. The one across the sort of loops over. The defender comes across, completely sells him for a dummy. He goes flying and he puts in the opposite corner past Zubizarreta. It's a brilliant goal. Salinas equalises not long after, actually, and it goes into extra time. But his free kick that he gets, the way he bends around the wall, I think the only angle you really ever see is the one behind the goal, and you see the bend through it goes around the wall, past Zubizarreta in the bottom corner. It's just a brilliant goal. And I think that this was the game. This is almost like it turned the public opinion back home. All of a sudden, the fans got behind the team again. And I think where there was a little bit of, sort of animosity towards the team, didn't love the team, all of a sudden it was like, all right, we're into the quarterfinal. And it's a bit like what happens in any tournament. People almost join the bandwagon, don't they? But this was a little bit more significant in the sense that they always say that this World Cup could have saved the nation. Personally, I don't think it could have done, but football can be a great healer in many things. And I think, if there was any sort of light or any sort of chance, then it was worth taking.
Yeah. So they went through against Spain in Verona, and then they headed to Florence to face Argentina. And it was a harrowing and undeserved loss, wasn't it, in that game that kind of ended their chances in that World Cup?
Yeah, very much so. I think that they outplayed Argentina, even though they went down to 10 men after 30 minutes. You know, and I saw the highlights not long ago, actually, and there was 2 chances. And even though I was in my seat and I literally still, you know, thought it was going to be a goal, and it didn't. You think this is 30 odd years ago, and I'm still getting excited about. Yeah. And you know what happens, but somehow I don't know why your body takes over, doesn't it? And yeah, they should have gone through. And even in the penalty shootout, you know, they were ahead. I think Stojkovic hits the bar, and then I think that, you know, I think it swung in their favour, and then Maradona misses, and then it swung back, and then, you know, was it Habibevic misses, and yeah, Yugoslavia are out. But it was such a shame, and I still don't understand why he didn't play Panchev. He had Panchev on the bench, didn't even bring him as a sub. You know, he could be taking a penalty. He was a fox in the box. And this thing goes back down. You know, there was always this talk about this quota that you had to have so many different players from different republics playing. And of course, this is the game where Katanic was threatened that if he played, his family would be harmed. So yeah. Ozim had no option other than to take him out of the team, and he was quite an important player. But the other sort of young players that he had, he didn't use. I think he trusted his older players again for experience at the big moment, which just makes you think, if he put a little bit more trust in youth, would he have got the result? But again, to be fair, they outplayed Argentina. They just didn't get the luck on the day. That's
it, yeah. So yeah, it was down to Osim's kind of pragmatism that possibly they didn't go through. And I know we're going to be painting a few hypotheses this evening, but if they would have advanced past Argentina, how do you think their tournament could have? Would you think they would have beaten Italy in the semi and gone on to the final?
Personally, I think Italy would have beaten them, and I think that was mainly due to the fact that he was quite, as you say, the pragmatism behind the team, probably wanting to play within themselves a bit, not wanting to give anything up. And I think the Italians, I know they were playing in Naples in that game, which I know wasn't their home, but you wouldn't have had the whole Maradona effect of splitting Naples between the Napoli thing and the Argentina thing and the north-south divide of Italy. That wouldn't have been there, and I think that it would have been a different game for Italy. I think they'd be more comfortable, and I think Italy would have won. And then what would have happened in the final between Italy and Germany, or West Germany, or if England even won against West Germany, we'll never know. But I think Italy would have beaten Yugoslavia.
Yeah, I think there's sort of like a few friends who went to watch Yugoslavian football during that period. They said that technically it was as good as any football in the world. But when if you were to put them in like the Premiership or the then old First Division, they'd just get battered every week because they didn't have that physicality to deal with it. It was all about technique and skill and all those things we love about the game.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that.
Yeah. So moving on, we're now going delve into club football for a short period of time, because around that period of time there was considerable club success in Europe, wasn't there?
Yeah, but before we get to that, there was also the final of the Under-21 Championships that was played just after Italia 90.
Of course, yes, Michael. Yeah.
No, sorry, that's probably my fault for changing the. But anyway, so yeah, they played the Soviet Union and they lost amazingly 7-3 over 2 legs. And I think this Soviet Union team is another team that's a team that obviously couldn't fulfill their potential in the 90s themselves because of what happens in the Soviet Union. But you know, they have players like Mostovoy, Kanchelskis, Shamalov, Uran. You know, so
yeah, they win obviously. Yeah, quite interestingly as well, in that final, it featured Andrei Bal, who played for the senior team in the 1982 World Cup.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, 8 years on, he was 32 and he was playing at under-21 level.
And of course, that Soviet team had won the Olympics in '88, so they sort of moved on. So you've got this new generation of Soviet players coming through, which, for whatever reason, they didn't take into club football into the 90s. You know, you could argue Kanchelskis and Mostovoy perhaps a set of ego, but on the whole, a lot of them, they didn't really fulfill their potential across the board. But, you know, they lost to the European Champion. You know, they lost the European Championship 7-3, which I think to a degree was a bit of a surprise. But as you say, it was then more about the 1991 season with Red Star.
Yeah, yeah. So tell us a little bit about that season, because I mean, their team was fantastic too, wasn't it? And it was built from that Yugoslav team of 1990. There was a lot of the components were in that side, weren't they?
Yeah, no, definitely. They had a really good side in '88 when they went out to AC Milan. It's the game of fog. Where they were really undone in that game. But they added a few more components to that team. So you got Mihajlovic. I think he'd come from what team he came from there, but he came into the side. Jugovic came into the side. Prosinecki was already there. Interested about Prosinecki. He played for Zagreb. They said he would never make as a footballer. His sort of dad or his uncle drove him over to Red Star. They gave him a trial and almost signed him instantly there and then on the spot because he was always such a great player. So I don't know quite what Zagreb were doing getting rid of him. Savicevic was in that side. You had Panchev, you had Binic. And they played really fast counter-attacking football. And I think the only player in that team that wasn't a Yugoslav was Romanian Beladeji. And obviously he'd had an interesting journey to get to that team as well, defecting from Ceausescu and serving a ban. But he was a really sort of old-fashioned sort of libero, as they call it, and sort of held the glue together. And they had a fantastic run in that cup, during the European Cup. Had a fantastic run. They were lucky against Grasshoppers, but they came against sort of Dynamo Dresden. Games against Bayern Munich are legendary. But it's in that period between the first leg and the second leg in the Bayern Munich game, that's when the first shots are fired in Croatia.
Yeah, so it's and also, I mean, that game itself, it was a weird game to watch because it sort of, there were some key moments that it kind of twisted upon, weren't there?
Well, in the Bayern Munich game, definitely.
Yeah.
Over in sort of Bayern Munich, away, they'd fantastic goal from Savicevic. The first goal that I think that Panchev scores, that is probably one of the best counter-attacking goals you'll ever see, where they sort of rob the ball in the sort of their own box almost, and literally it's just ping, ping, ping. Prosinecki plays like a 60-yard pass to Binic, and Binic, one of the fastest people in Yugoslavia, and he says he could have beaten Carl Lewis in a race. But all he could do really was just run very fast, and then he put a crossover to Panchev. And so they went back to Maracana, with the advantage. And that, as you said, that game, Mihajlovic scores a free kick, and then it swung. It went back in sort of Bayern Munich's favour, and then almost in the last minute, I think a cross comes in from Mihajlovic, and Argon Taylor takes a swing on it, and it takes a massive slice, loops over the keeper, and they're through. But what a game that is! What a game! Yeah,
I always look at that moment and think, how did the keeper not keep it out? It was just, it was a weird one, wasn't it? It was just how did that end up in the back of the net? It was a crazy moment to decide a game of such magnitude. Yeah.
No, it's unbelievable game. I think if you can watch the highlights on YouTube, and well worth watching those goals on YouTube, most definitely.
Yeah. So we're moving on now to the final in Barry. Talk us through that game, Michael.
Well, there isn't much to talk about really in terms of action. This is my first European sort of cup final I ever watched, which is such a shame really that it was built up as a really sort of classic final. It should be of really talented attacking talent. Look at that Marseille side of Waddle and Pele and Bidi Pele and Papan up front, and against the team we just talked about of Red Star Belgrade. And it should have been literally a team that should have gone hammer and tongs at each other. But I think with the Yugoslav, they'd had a habit of getting to. This is against Yugoslav. This is club teams and national teams. They had a habit of getting to finals and semi-finals and failing, and by playing their own game. And the manager, he basically said, today we're not playing our game. We're going to play another way and literally shut up shop and play for penalties, which is what they did, and they won. Unfortunately, it made such a game that should have just been an absolutely amazing spectacle. Wasn't. But at the end of the day, it's their name that's on the trophy. And however they did it, you can't take that away.
No, it was one of those hugely disappointing final, but probably the only the Steaua Barcelona one compares to it in Anyway, so let's move on to the back into national team territory in the 1992 qualifying campaign. With turmoil brewing at home, Yugoslavia embarked on the qualification. So what kinds of challenges do you think they faced during that campaign?
Well, you can always look at this qualifying campaign in two, really, that they were drawn with Denmark, Austria, Northern Ireland and the Faroe Islands, and they literally carried on their Italia 90 form and were literally just straight out the blocks. You know, they beat Northern Ireland 2-0, Austria 4-1, Denmark 2-0, and then beat Northern Ireland 4-1. So they'd almost sort of qualified to a degree by the turn of sort of like 1991, which was a good thing, really, because the last game that Yugoslavia played as a unified nation with all the countries able to play for Yugoslavia was the 16th of May 91 when they beat Faroe Islands 7-0. And after that, Croatia and Slovenia went independent on the 25th of June 91. So this is when the challenges sort of start almost coming in, because before those first 6 games, they could choose anyone they liked. And as I said, you're talking Prosinecki, Boban, Savicevic, Panchev, Mihailovic, Jugovic, Stimac, you know, the list goes on and on and on. But then, of course, after the 25th of June, where Croatia and Slovenia split, you can only now call upon sort of Serbian players, Montenegrin players, and the Macedonian players for a little bit longer. So you've lost, you know, Boban, you've lost Prosinecki, you've lost Suka, you've lost Bolcic, you've lost Katanic, you've lost some really, really top players. But you're still left with a really good bunch of players as well. And they, for the last 2 games, they still won. They beat Faroe Islands 2-0 and Austria 2-0. So they literally walked that qualifying group, playing some really sort of explosive football. I think they only let in 4 goals and scored something like 20 odd goals, and just for scoring goals for fun. And then, of course, it comes to an end in 92.
Yeah. So what happened in the lead up to the tournament? Can you talk us through what happened with UEFA and in regards to their? Well, they weren't there. We all know that. But what happened prior to that?
Well, they effectively kicked out. There's a UN resolution that was passed, I think on was it sort of April? Was it the 1st of April or something? It was like they did about April Fool's Day, and then literally sort of 10 days before the tournament, they were suspended from all sporting activities. And that was the end of that. And that was mainly due to the war in Bosnia, really, because, you know, once you start seeing on the news shelling of apartment blocks and you start seeing snipers killing people, queuing for bread, it's public opinion turns against you quite quickly. With what was going on, you know, all you really had left was the Serbian players, the Macedonian players. It's a Panchev basically gone. But as I said, the Serbian players are still going to go, and I think they're even actually in Sweden. I think they're at the hotel, and I think it's then when they came through, they said, "You're not playing," and they were sent home. And I think I saw something of Savicevic, Stojkovic, and I think he was interviewed, and he sort of said they didn't want to go home. They didn't want to go home and face reality, and I don't blame them for 1 minute. And you know, I suppose it always comes down to that question of what would have happened if Yugoslavia went to Euro 92. But I think the Yugoslavia that would have gone to Euro 92 in its current political form was not the Yugoslavia that people expect.
Yeah. And also the depletion of spirit as well. You're embarking on a tournament where the appetite isn't really there. But you have to say, with the squad they had at the beginning of qualification, they would have had a really good chance. But it wasn't the same squad, was it?
No, I think this is when the questions start coming in, and the what ifs. And I think if you take what started playing the qualifying tournament in 1990 for the 92 European Championships, and those players were still able to play at Euro 92 as a unified nation, and what happened didn't happen, you've got to say that team either would have won it or would have been very, very close to winning it, just because the names. And to be fair to Osim, he was very good. I know he sometimes didn't pick the right teams, and he was quite sort of pragmatic, but he managed to keep a unity with his players, which, with what was going on in his country at the time, that was no mean feat at all. So he did a remarkable job to do what he did. Just imagine if he didn't have to play those games, and those players were allowed to play as unified players. I honestly think they would have been there or thereabouts. They had to have been.
Yeah, yeah. I've seen was like a bit Tito-esque in the way that he dragged it all together at that time, wasn't he? But
yeah, definitely.
So let's move on a few years. Yugoslavia didn't qualify for 94 or 96, but they were there at 98, weren't they? And in the next qualifiers for the major finals, they were in a tough group that they came through. But let's talk about the playoff, because that was an iconic game, wasn't it? That really brought Yugoslavia back into the attention of the European football community.
Yeah, no, definitely. If you're talking about the playoff when they played Hungary, and they literally smashed Hungary apart. I think it's like 12-1. I think Mijatovic, he scores something like 7 goals. I think he scores 4 in one game and 3 in another. And yeah, there were some decent teams in that playoff, and they were quite lucky drawing Hungary, if I'm honest. I think Italy were in that, and I think Ireland were in that group as well. So they were lucky getting Hungary, and they just smashed them apart. But but before that, obviously, USA 94, they were originally drawn in a group, but obviously they weren't allowed to take part. But they weren't allowed to take part. But obviously the other countries, obviously Croatia went to Euro 96, and they re-emerged. And with Prosinecki, Suka, Boban, and Bopsic, and I think I mentioned Suka. And of course they had Stimac, they had Bilic, and of course they had Asanovic as well. They did really, really well at Euro 96, and I think that going into sort of 98, they were there as well. But yeah, it was, you start seeing these, if again, Croatia did really well, you then add the other team together, and you think if they all came together again, what could have happened? But yeah, again, going back to France 98, you said you're right, they sort of re-emerged, they came out. And this is when I remember this, because this is when as I said, Stojkovic, I fell in love with Stojkovic in 1990, and I get told off now on Twitter if I post things of Stojkovic. He's one guy that goes, oh, him again. So I've stopped doing it. But yeah, so he reappeared. I know, because of course he went to Japan, and you didn't see him over here, and reappeared. And of course it was like, oh my God, Stojkovic is back. And I think he was 33 at this point. But yeah, they just, as I said, they're in quite a politically charged group. Funny enough, Yugoslavia, obviously with Iran and the USA, and obviously with Germany as well. And yeah, the team that they picked, I think they picked a really young Jagan Stankovic as well. So this is when Stankovic comes in. Of course, they've got Sava Milosevic appears. So of course, Villa fans remember him. So again, they sort of had the players that they had back in the early end of the 90s. A few new players that have come into the team, and they beat Iran 1-0. That was sort of Mihajlovic. They drew 2-2 with Germany, and this is probably the key game because they were 2-0 up. And obviously they let those 2 late goals in, and they beat USA 1-0. So they went through, but they could have gone through as group winners, and they could have played Mexico. But instead they played Holland, and they lost 2-1. They were really defensive in that game. But he missed a penalty. Mijatovic missed a penalty, but it took a 90-second winner from Megadavi. It's a really low drive. To win that game. But again, if they played Mexico, it could have been different.
Yeah. I mean, it was a half decent Mexico side, but you would have felt that the European power would have taken them out of the equation, which would have then, we talked about this previously, but would have opened up for a very interesting hypothesis for the quarter final in Lyon, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and I didn't think of this until you messaged me, and I was like, oh my God, yeah, you're quite right. And yeah, they could have played Croatia in the quarterfinal, which would have just been unbelievable. I think it's, if they were in the other end of the draw, and obviously they weren't because they went to the other end, and they played a really good Dutch team. But yeah, if you talk about what would have happened in that game, personally, I think Croatia probably won that game. I think Croatia probably a little bit. I think their legs were a little bit more. I think with Prosinecki, Boban, I think they had a little bit more in their legs. A few more younger players coming through. I think their squad was slightly better than Yugoslavia overall. But what would have happened in Lyon, in the stands and in the streets? That's the other question.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I think I don't think it would have been a game for the purist, and I don't think it would have been particularly a game favoured by the local Lyonnaise police force either. So,
No,
but
not at
yeah,
all.
so yeah, Yugoslavia v Croatia. What a fireworks, as you said in your absolute fireworks. So we'll move on to 2000 and what proved to be the swan song for the Yugoslavian national side. But there were some memorable games during that tournament, weren't there, Michael?
Yeah, but I think we just talked about Yugoslavia and Croatia, what could have happened at France '98. But of course, they played each other in the qualifying group.
Yeah,
which
yeah.
I think when the draw was made in Yugoslavia with Croatia and Macedonia as well, I think there was a few gasps, thinking, "Oh my God!" And you know, sure enough, there were fireworks, and you know, the game in Belgrade was 0-0, and there was a power outage. And the lights went off, and I think I read somewhere that the only lights that were on show were infrared lights all around the stadium that were sniper rifles on the Croats. And you think, oh my God! And then the return leg, return game, I should say, was in Croatia, and that was 2-2. And there was a big Vukovar 91 sign, and that was one of the big sort of hot spots of the war in 91. And I think that was a real sort of reference and hatred. And there was a really famous sending off that I think Merkovic, I think he grabs Yanni by the testicles and gives him a squeeze and got sent off. And you know, Yugoslavia qualified, and he becomes a hero for that moment. So yeah, no love lost, no love lost. And so yeah, you're quite right. There was some really memorable games in Euro 2000 where they drew with Slovenia. So again, that's another ex-republic. And they were 3-0 down and came back to 3-3. And they beat Norway 1-0, the Milosevic goal. And then there's that really classic game, which I think probably gets a little bit forgotten about, actually. And when you talk about it, people remember it. And that's when they lost 3-4 to Spain, which was a really brilliant game. I think Alfonso, scores.
Yeah, the winner about 5 minutes into injury time, doesn't he?
Yeah. So they qualified ahead of Norway, I think, on the fact that they beat Norway because they're pretty much level on points, but they'd also scored more goals. But then they just got absolutely smashed apart by Holland 6-1 in the quarterfinal. And Yugoslavia's goal was actually, I think, in injury time. Kluivert got 3 and Overmars got 2. And that Dutch team, I think, at that point, and they were at home, they had home advantage, and I thought that Dutch team were going to run away with that tournament. And obviously they got held back by France and Italy, you know, because they got to the final. But yeah, that was the end of Yugoslavia, really. That was, you know, the swan song, the players that had come through in '87, you know, the real top players, the Mijatović's and the Savicevic's, they'd come to the end of the road. I think Stojkovic was now 35. They didn't have the legs. The younger players coming through, there was a few talented players. I said Stankovic there. I think even Kezman played for PSV and Chelsea. But there wasn't enough talent around them. And it was a real surprise that Croatia didn't actually qualify, because, you know, they came third at France '98 and they went to Korea, Japan 2002, but they finished third in this group, which was a real surprise, getting to the qualifying group.
Yeah. Well, thank you for bringing this. And that was it. That was curtains. That was it. That was the end of Yugoslavia as a competitive nation in European and world football. So, but thank you for bringing that story alive for us, Michael. That's fantastic. But now we're going to move on. Now you're a Brighton fan, aren't you, mate? And
yes, Brighton fan with my sins.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the really the golden era for Brighton at the moment, isn't it? It's the good new days, if you can call them that.
Very much so. No, very much so. It's one of those things you sort of think, well, is this as good as it's going to get? And I thought that last season, and then this season, we then finish 6th and get into Europe, and you think, oh, is this as good as it's going to get? It's one of those things you've always got to pinch yourself. If the club's has been where it has been since I've supported, because I'm I've turned 40 now, unfortunately, and I remember the dark old days where we're at the Goldstone, and we didn't have the Goldstone, and all those when we were at the bottom of the league, and I remember those days vividly. So to be where we are now in state of the art stadium, you got to pinch yourself and you just enjoy it, because you never know when it's going to end, and hopefully it doesn't. But things are in cycles, aren't they? And you just hope it continues for as long as it can, and as long as it does.
Well, that's it, and hopefully there's a trophy somewhere down the line in the near future. They've come close a couple of times. So, yeah, we're talking about Brighton. It's all positive, but that's not what we're going to look at tonight. We're going to look at the some of the really horrible moments in the club's history. I asked you to compile 3 of your Brighton worst games ever, and you sent me back 3, which all must hold incredibly painful memories for you, Michael. Would you like to start with the first one? Talk us through that one.
Yeah, no, this has really been a sort of therapy session, this has, Phil, and a bit of counselling almost. So,
oh, glad to help, mate. Glad to help.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not sending you an invoice though. But I think similar to what Rob did recently, Rob Fletcher, is that he obviously chose 3 games that he'd actually been to in the flesh. So I went along with that. I thought that was a good idea. So the first game I went to was our first game that I'm going to choose. And shapes a lot of my life actually. When I've been thinking about this, and it does actually, which is quite scary. And that's the 1991 playoff final defeat to Notts County, where we lost 3-1 at Wembley. And I think anyone who knows me personally in work or socially down the pub will know I'm one of the most pessimistic fans you'll ever know. I always think that my team's going to lose, it's going to draw, there's going to be a bad refereeing decision, someone's going to get sent off. You can now add VAR into the mix in that as well. That something's going to go against you, and it all stems from this game. And I think that was because I was just absolutely convinced that we were going to win this game. And we had quite a good little team. We had John Byrne up front, Mike Small, we had Mark Barham on the right, and we had Clive Walker, who was having a bit of an Indian summer in his career, on the left. We had Dean Wilkins in the middle, pulling the strings. But if we had a weakness, it was at the back. And we obviously finished in the playoffs with a minus goal difference. And I think that says it all. But I think as a 9-year-old, you don't look at that. And, we brought in Colin Pates from Arsenal. We picked up Stefan Ivone from Stade Bucharest. And, he was the 86 winning European Cup captain. So you think, we got a bit of prestige in the back here and this should work. But it didn't. But I think it was the fact that we beat Millwall 6-2 in the semi-final, and we beat them 4-1 at home and then 2-1 away. And I think you get on that momentum. You think, oh my god, and that Millwall team had Sheringham, and it's still the nucleus of the team that had been in the first division the previous season before they got relegated. So I think we beaten real top quality opposition there, and went to that game, as I said, absolutely full of expectation that we were going to do it. But what I didn't realise, this is because obviously of my age, that Notts County team was actually really good. It had sort of Craig Short at the back, who obviously went to play for Derby and Everton, and they had Mark Draper in the midfield, who went to Leicester and Villa. And they had Kevin Bartlett, if you remember him, he was hotly tipped to win the Rumbelow Sprint Challenge final, but he was carrying a slight niggle and he lost the final to John Williams. But, he was a really quick, dangerous player. And he had Dave Regis, and the player I joke and call him my nemesis, and the player that broke my heart, and that's Tommy Johnson, of all people. Obviously, playing for Villa and Derby himself later. Because he scores 2 goals. And of course, they're managed by Neil Warnock. So, you get that old pantomime villain, Neil Warnock.
And the promotion Midas he was, wasn't he?
Yeah.
He used to get everyone promoted.
Yeah, exactly. So you add that in and you think, again, I didn't know this. So you sort of go up on the day, it's my first away day. And I think, we're driving up the A24 from where I live up to, the M25. And of course, I'm with my dad and my uncle. And I'm waving the scarf out the window, and of course, then you got other cars doing the same as well. And of course, this happens at away days, doesn't it? All the time, the cup finals and playoffs, everyone going up the motorway. And of course, this is the first one he's ever done. And I was really carried away with this. And I think there was a cutout in the newspaper that I'd taken with me, and I was throwing it out the window. And of course, I was completely just swept up in this moment. And then, of course, you get to Wembley, you see the Twin Towers. That's a magical thing. And then I remember we got to the game. And we were sitting, my dad got seats, the old literally just the plastic sheet with no back to the seats. So I saw absolutely nothing of this game. All I could actually see was the floodlights around the side of the top of the roof of the stadium. And all I actually really remember from that game was hearing the Notts County fans cheer 3 times. and us cheering once right at the end and losing 3-1. And I'm saw the highlights on YouTube about in the pandemic, couple of years back, And we actually played better than I thought. I thought we were rubbish in that day, but John Byrne didn't play a slight knock, and he came on as a sub. But I think when I go back to the pessimism, as I said, I was so up here thinking we're going to win, and then that come down is so massive that I think if you go to a game expecting the worst and you come out with a result that's better, you can't be disappointed. And that's probably a really bad way of watching football, but that's how I watch football now. And and I think I try to think where that had all come from, and it comes from that game.
Oh dear.
So yeah, the 91 player final still holds many a bad memory.
So your 9-year-old self was scarred by that, but things were going to get much worse over the forthcoming years. At the end of the following season, Brighton were relegated to the 3rd tier, and it just set a spiral in motion, didn't it?
Oh, very much so. So the next game that I've chosen is a bit of an oddball one, really. It's in many ways, but there is a reason, and we'll come to that. Was against Lincoln in 1996, and you're quite right. We got relegated in 92 down to 3rd tier, and then we sort of were in that league for a few years, and we got relegated in 96 down to the 4th tier, which is Division 3, I think. At this it was named at the time, and the club had gone through sort of was in financial trouble anyway in 91, but it got worse. These new owners appeared I think when owners buy a stake in the club for £56.25p, you've got to start asking questions. And they promised investment, and the investment actually was just a loan with really high interest rates, which was mortgaged against the ground and the club's assets, which nobody knew at first. And then of course it was discovered, I think as a fan discovered, and also you also discovered the charter had been changed, that any sale of assets a private company couldn't, or a company, a private individual or a company couldn't profit from the sale of the club. That clause was removed. So it doesn't take much to put 2 and 2 together and think, oh, I know where this is going. And that started a complete sort of war between the owners and the fans. The performances on the pitch suffered massively. The owners then sold the ground. We had no home. It was just a really toxic, awful atmosphere around the club. And so we got relegated in 96. I thought we'd go straight back up, because our team actually on paper wasn't actually that bad. We had Craig Maskell up front. We had Ian Baird, and they've both been in the top division. Stuart Storer, I love Stuart Storer, was on the right. So I thought, we should go back up. But we won the first game 2 against Chesterfield, and I remember going to that. But again, slowly the atmosphere was so bad, the performances were so bad, and we ended up sort of being second at bottom around this time. And the season before, we'd invaded the pitch, and we were threatened against York, and we had to play a game behind closed doors, and we were threatened with any more pitch invasions, we'd lose points. The FA were not helping us. They weren't hearing what we were shouting about. And we played Lincoln. It was a midweek game under the lights, and Lincoln scored, and there was a pitch invasion. And about 300 fans were on the pitch. The police took a softly approach, got them removed. The game restarted. The players came back out. Brighton equalised. And it was all good. And then Lincoln scored again. And then there was another pitch invasion. And this is the really significant thing. But all of a sudden, the majority of fans that stayed in the stands started booing. So I think they realised the implications of what had happened with the first goal. Again, I was 15 at this time. So I was a little bit, I knew what was going on, but not fully, if that makes any sense. Now I see the whole picture, but I didn't really at the time. And so these fans that obviously then invaded the pitch, then almost sort of went back into the stand with a sort of towel between their legs almost. So the fans had almost sort of self-regulated that pitch invasion. But of course, the consequences, I think what had happened is between the first goal and the second goal, the majority of fans had gone, we're going to lose points here. We're in big trouble. We need all the help we can get. If we start invading the pitch, we're not showing the club in the right light. And there was that real change of momentum between the first goal and the second goal. And I think it was, if we're going to take the fight on, we've got to think things differently. But at that moment in time, we were 2-1 down. We let another goal in. We lost 3-1. And the reason I've chosen that was because, again, it's the turning point is this game, in my opinion, for many things. It got worse because they then sacked Jimmy Case not long after this. We got Steve Gritt, and then we go on this really amazing run. But it was leaving that game that day and getting the train with my mates. You think we've lost 3-1. We're now staring potential relegation battle staring in the face. We've got no ground. We've got no future. We're up at the FA now for a hearing. That's not going to come out well. And you're really thinking, you know, what the hell is going to happen to my club? And I think that moment in time, you're probably at one of your lowest, really. And, you know, I wanted to choose a game from this season because it's such a momentous season for the club, but also for me as a 15-year-old. I've written about this and put it on my page. But, you know, a few weeks later, we played Hereford and we lost 1-0, but there was an organised sort of walkout, and it was a different way of protesting. I remember there were fireworks went off down the side of the road, which that's now next to where there's a Nando's and a Burger King, because it's now a retail park, my old football ground. And and then, of course, you know, that was a different way of looking at it. There was protest that way, but we didn't lose any points. But then things changed. You know, David Davis of the FA got involved and started mediating. The consortium came on, and lots of things changed. But I think leaving that game, being on the train at Hove train station and getting the train, looking at the stadium and thinking, what the hell is going to happen to my club, is probably one of the worst moments that you can have as a football fan. Yeah,
I'd say I spoke to like Gary Thacker about this a couple of weeks ago, and he said, like, the age of 15, it's when you are the most intensely in love with your football club. It never really gets as personal as it does at that age. So having to endure that at that age, that's got to be a real grievous experience, mate.
Yeah, no, definitely. You know, it's not like you haven't lost a cup final, you haven't lost a semi-final. It's not, you know, that type of emotion, but it's very much the survival of your club. It's
a different kind of awful, isn't it? Yeah, we've all walked away from playoff finals, and you get to fight another day. But if you're standing on the precipice of losing your club, it's completely different. It's a completely different story.
Yeah, completely.
So moving on, things did improve. Brighton moved through the divisions again, and we revisit their history in 2013 for a playoff semi-final, don't we?
Oh, yeah, you can hear my groan that this game really hurts. You know, for a number of reasons, and I think this game, I really struggle to talk about this game now, actually, Phil, and I sort of went against my golden rule of not thinking you're going to win, and this game I thought we were going to win, and then look what happens. So to put it into context, we played Palace in the semi-final, the second leg. The first leg at Selhurst Park on a Friday night, we drew 0-0. I think we probably edged it and outplayed them. We had a really good side. You know, we had Matty Upson in defence, Wayne Bridge, Gordon Greer, we had Kuszczek in goal, we had Orlandi, we had Ulloa, and of course my favourite player of all time for Brighton, Vicente, which Poyet didn't play. I think, you know, was he injured? Was there issues with the manager? I think it's probably a bit of both, but anyway. And of course Glenn Murray got injured in that game. You know, there was a top goal scorer, so he got an Achilles or an ACL. So you think we didn't score obviously, but we sort of go back to the Amex. We'd beaten them quite convincingly back in the March. I can't remember if it was 3-0 or 3-1, but we'd beaten them quite convincingly. And I thought we were going to win, and I think everyone in that stadium probably thought we were going to win. I think even the Palace fans perhaps even thought that we were going to win, because, you know, Palace at the beginning of the season, I think they were at Bolton. Didn't really work out for him. Ian Holloway came in. They think they sort of like they hung on to where they were in the league and stayed in the playoffs. But I think, yes, I think I went to that game with my dad's. I remember thinking, you know, we're going to win this, and there was this atmosphere, and we had these like horrible things now called now. We had these clackers that were put on the seats, and the idea was we'd wave them all and make this really loud, intimidating atmosphere, which actually didn't work at all. But I think, unbeknown to us, there were things going on behind the scenes. And the story goes that the Palace bus was given the wrong directions, and it went the wrong way. And then when it did arrive, and the players went to the dressing room, they found the showers were full of human feces. I won't go into more detail than that. And, you know, the players obviously discovered this, and it was, you know, obviously, if that's correct, it's disgusting, and, you know, shouldn't have ever happened. And I think Ian Holloway's team talk was easily, it was literally that's what they think of us. Go out there and prove you're better than that, and we are better than that. You know, Zaha was absolutely fuming. I listened to a podcast on the other week on the Jonathan Pearce and Terry Alderton podcast, and you know, he was on that, and he sort of said, you know, that Zaha was absolutely so incensed and wanted to do something, and Holloway said, look, I'll sort this out, you just get out on the pitch and do what you need to do and teach them. And of course he scores 2 goals, and you know, he scored a header, which is quite rare, and he scored a really good sort of swivel finish in the box, and you know, we lost 2-0. And you know, fairness to Palace, they went and beat Watford in the playoff final, and then they've never been relegated since. And you know, so they've been there for 10 years, and fair play to them. But there's nothing worse than being in your home ground and seeing 4,000 Palace fans, or how many thousand fans it was, jumping up and down, shouting that song, "We love you, we love you," and then the other one, "Glad all over." It is just the worst moment as a Brighton fan in your home stadium, seeing that. And that's why it's really hard to talk about, Phil.
And of course, there's that horrible historical needle between Palace and Brighton as well that stems back several years. Oh dear. Yeah. Well, mate, can I just say thank you for coming on tonight? You've really kind of put some flesh on the bones of the Yugoslavian story. And I'm sorry I had to put you through that Brighton kind of trilogy.
Oh, it's okay.
Trilogy of horror. Anyway, guys, you commented, you said you've got a page. Would you like to tell us about that, so anybody who's interested in tracking you down can find you?
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, I've got a page on Twitter, as you alluded to at the beginning. So it's the 80s, 90s football page on Twitter. We show videos of old games, team pictures. We try and do Manager Monday, Winger Wednesday, or Team Thursday, and feature something. Try and keep it as it's all levels. It's not just the glory. It's also try and involve sort of lesser teams as well, and all over the world. Really try and be as inclusive as possible. So yeah, if you haven't seen it, please follow.
Fantastic. Well, I'm a big fan of your stuff, guys, mate. I'm on it virtually all the time, so I can very much recommend that. So thank you, everyone, for listening in, and we'll see you next week for more Football Geeks chats with all the great stories. See you next time.
Thank you.